Hi everyone, welcome to the cow tutorial. This lovely lady lives on the property next door to me, and I took a photo of her and I've transferred the outline of her onto some Arches hot press paper. Now the paper is 300 GSM or 140 pound in weight, and it's 36 centimetres by 51 centimetres, which is about 14 inches by 20 inches. Now I've stretched the paper and I've attached it to some gator board. If you want to know how I stretch my watercolour paper, I have a tutorial here on Patreon that runs through my process for you. Betty Hayways has sent me a set of brushes to try, so I'm going to use them on this painting and see what they're like. These are synthetic Kolinsky sable brushes, and there's 7 round brushes in this set, ranging from a 00 right up to a number 11. Now these are supposed to hold lots of water and still hold their shape, so I'm looking forward to using them. I'm going to paint the background first on this painting. Sometimes I'll paint the background first and other times I'll paint it last. Sometimes it's a good idea to paint it first just in case you make a mess of it. If you do, you can start a new painting without having spent all your time on the subject. When I paint the background last, it's usually because I'm not sure what colours I'm going to need and I want to see the subject finished before I decide what to do. In this case, I've painted this cow before, so I knew in advance what I wanted it to look like. I'm going to start with my number 11 Betty Hayways brush. This brush is the largest in the set, and I'm just going to wet the paper underneath the ear here and beside the cow. I'm just going to take it right down to the bottom right corner. Now I want my paper to be fairly wet, so I'm putting a fair amount of water on. If you're not sure about how wet your paper should be, just take a look at my video here on Patreon about paper wetness. You want your paper to be wet, not damp. And by wet, I mean if you were to tilt your paper, the paint would move and drip across the surface. So the water hasn't soaked into the paper at all, it's just sitting on top of the surface. So I just take it carefully around the cow so I don't get any water onto the cow because I don't want any paint on there yet. And I just paint it onto the background. And I'll do this in sections. I don't want to wet the whole background at once because it will dry before I get to it. So I'm just going to switch to my bigger Casaneo brush now. This is a number 16 oval pointed wash brush. Now that I've moved away from the ear, I don't have to use that smaller brush. I can use this bigger one, it just gets the water on there quicker. Okay, I'm going to pick up some of the watery Windsor Violet now with my smaller brush. This is the round brush again, so that I can get in here beside the ear. So I just paint it straight onto the wet paper. I take it carefully beside the ear here, and then when I move away from the cow I don't have to be quite so careful. So my water goes up to here, but I won't take my paint all the way up there. So now I can use this bigger brush and just do the same thing with the violet. So I make sure I don't take my paint right up to that water's edge. I keep it within the boundaries of the water there. Now I want some French ultramarine. And I paint that on as well. So I'm just going to have a mixture of the two colours. Just needs to be a little bit darker, so I'm just putting a bit more paint into the watery mix. That's better. So that will just blend with the violet on the paper because it's wet. So now I'll switch back to the violet and that'll just blend with the French ultramarine. So just play around with your background and see what you can come up with. Just take it carefully beside the cow so that I don't get any paint on there. And I just got a little drop then. I've switched back to my round brush now just to tidy up the edge before it dries. There's not a lot of work done on the body of the cow, so I need to get this edge right. So now I can wet further. So I just meet up with the water edge that I had before. And I just wet the paper further around. Now I won't wet all of it, I'm just going to wet up to the top corner here. I've got to work fairly quickly when I paint the background just so that the paper doesn't dry. And I make sure I keep my paint well within those boundaries of the water edge. So now I want some more violet. Take it beside the ear with this smaller round brush, just so I get a nice edge. If you want your paint to be darker, you just mix more paint, more pigment into the water. Switching back to my bigger brush now, and just puts the paint on a bit quicker for me. You can tilt your board if you like, just to make the paint run. Now I've got some of the French ultramarine. You can see there's a fair amount of water there because it's making the paint run. Back to painting on some more water, and I just meet up with the water's edge where I stopped last time. My brush must have a tiny bit of paint still in it, but that's okay, at least you can see where I'm putting the water. Switching back to the bigger brush so I can put it on quicker. Take it up to that top corner now. And then some more watery paint. These two colours I will be using on the cow, so that's why I've chosen them for the background. Back to the bigger brush now and some more of the French ultramarine. More of the violet. If you put it on a bit dark, just get some more water on your brush and spread it out. Sometimes you might pick up more pigment than you mean to. And if that happens, just dip your brush into the water and just dilute it. So now I'm wetting further around. So this is just water, even though it looks slightly purple. It's just that I haven't washed my brush out properly. Just taking it right down to the bottom corner now. All the time I'm trying to be careful not to get any paint on the cow. Some more violet. I use the brush right up on its tip, just so I get those nice edges on the cow. I want some more of the blue. And more violet. And now some more of the French ultramarine. And back into the violet again. So just play with the colours if you want to and just alternate between the two, or you can just do it one colour if you prefer. So that's how it's looking now. It's still wet, but I can look for areas that are starting to dry and I can drop some water in. I want to create some watercolour blooms. Dropping this water in just disturbs the pigment as it's drying and it just dislodges it and creates these lovely shapes on the background. So I'm just looking for the areas that are starting to dry or where the sheen is starting to go off the paper, and that's where I'm dropping the water on. It doesn't work if the paper's too wet, so you just need to wait till it dries a little bit. Sometimes you wait too long and the paper's too dry, so it's just a matter of timing. I do have a video here on Patreon that is just dedicated to watercolour blooms, how to make them and how to avoid them. So just watch that if you're not sure. So if you don't want watercolour blooms on your background, just skip over this section and just let your background dry normally. The other thing I sometimes do is I grab my spray bottle and I just half squeeze the trigger in, and then that just gives me those larger drops of water. Okay, so my painting has dried now and this is what it looks like. I've included this progress photo for you just so you can see what the background looks like before I paint the cow. So everything's dry, as I said. Now I just want to wet the top of the head here with some water. So I'm just using my large round brush again. I wet the area larger than I want it to be. Now I don't want this to be as wet as the background, I just want it to be damp. So the water's not floating around on the surface of the paper, it's just soaked in just a little bit. Now this is burnt sienna that I've got here, it's watery burnt sienna. I'm just going to paint it on top of the damp paper here, across the top of the head. Now it's not too dark. I will go darker, but not just yet. So now I've just got a damp brush here and I'm just softening that edge further. Switching down to my smaller brush, this is a number 5. Just need a bit more control now. So some more watery burnt sienna, and I just want to take it down further here at the front, right in the centre of the head. So I'm just dabbing it with my brush. Just sort of dotting the paint on. And you can see that I'm staying within the boundaries of the water there. I haven't taken the paint right up to the edge of the water. Now I want some sepia. And I just want to put this on the top of the head here. So now I'm just spreading it out with my brush. Again, I'm just dotting with the brush. Just tapping it onto the surface of the paper. A little bit more of the burnt sienna down here. And I want some more sepia now. This time it's a bit darker. Just right at the top there. So I'm just dabbing with my brush, and the paper is not quite as damp as it was when I first started painting. And I'll just take a few little hair flicks off the top here. Okay, so now I want to mix up my grey that I like to mix. So I'm going to use the French ultramarine and the burnt sienna. So this is the French ultramarine. I mix it into the water. And then I'll get some burnt sienna. Here it is here. Bit more of the blue. Now that's too dark, I need to add some water to that. So I'll just drop some water in there. Just to dilute it, and a tiny bit more blue. It's always a good idea to check your mixes on a spare piece of paper before you put it onto your painting. So I'm just using the smaller round brush here. I'm painting on dry paper, just on this little section just above the ear, just with that grey that I've mixed up. So I'll wash the paint out of my brush now, and I'll just dry it on the cloth, and I can use it just to soften that edge further. I'm also going to drop some Winsor Violet on there while it's still damp. I'm going to do the same thing on this other side of the head. Even though it's not there on the reference photo, I still want to put it in. Okay, so I've moved in a bit closer, and I just want to paint over this left eye here. Now I've got the grey paint again. I picked up the watery paint and then I dabbed off the excess on my cloth. And I'm just going to paint on the dry paper here. So I must remember to leave the eyelid showing, so I don't want any paint on that. Now I've just washed the paint out of my brush. There's just water on my brush now. I have enough paint on the paper. I can just spread it out now with my damp brush. A little bit goes a long way. So you don't want this to be too dark. Just a light grey is all you need. So now I'm washing my brush out again. I just want to soften that edge there. So just with the damp brush, I just soften it away. You don't want your brush to be too wet when you do that, otherwise it'll just create another wet puddle and the paint will rush into it. So some more of the grey mix here, just underneath the eye. Just looking at the reference photo as I paint, just trying to paint the shapes that I see. Moving down to a smaller brush. This is a number 3. I've been using a number 5. I just want to use a smaller brush now to paint the eyelashes and the eye. So this is Winsor Violet, and I'm just blocking in the eyelashes just in one whole piece. I'm not painting individual lashes. It's just a shape that I'm painting, and I'll break it up with the black later on. Here I've got some lamp black. I've been using it before and my sauce is getting a bit messy. So I'm just watering it down here, mixing a bit of water with it, and I'll use the watery lamp black. So everything's dry, eyelashes are dry and the area around the eye is dry, and I'm just painting the watery lamp black onto the eye itself. Just on the dry paper. Now I'm using the watery lamp black because I don't want it too dark just yet. I will put darker paint over the top, but for now I just want it a bit lighter. So I'm just establishing the shape of the eye, painting carefully, looking at my reference photo, just so that I get the shape right. And then I want to bring it down underneath, just carefully under here. I want to leave some white paper showing too, so just on top of the grey area that I've just painted, leaving the white paper showing there. So now I'm switching to my little Da Vinci 00 Maestro brush. This is a little liner brush that I like to use. So I want some lower eyelashes, just with the lamp black again. This I can do little flicks with my brush. I also want to take it above the eyelid, just a fine line of black. All of this is on the dry paper. So now I've got some darker paint on my brush. So what I did was I wiped my wet brush over the pigment where it squirted out, just to get that dark paint. Still painting on the dry paper. I don't want to fill in the whole eye here. I just want to leave some of that lighter black paint showing. I'm also going to use this brush to separate that section of eyelashes here, just by painting the black through it. It just breaks it up a bit. Now because the cow is so far away, you can't really see the detail on the eyes. So I'm just sort of trying to keep them fairly simple. So I'm still using the darker paint here. Just separating the eyelashes again. I'm going to do the same thing on this other eye. I'm using the watery lamp black on the dry paper. I establish the shape with the watery colour, and then I'll come back with the darker colour later. So I'm just painting that underneath the eye like I did on the other one, leaving the white paper showing there. Switch down to my smaller 00 brush and darker paint now. I'm just going to paint some little eyelashes underneath as well. So I've got some more paint now. I'm just going to take that above the eye, over the top of the eyelashes. And I'm also going to put some in the eye itself, but I'm not going to completely cover that lighter area. I want some of that to still show. And I'll also separate some of those eyelashes with this brush. I'm just going to bring in the top of the eyelid with that too, just take it over the top. And then the white paper will just become the eyelid. Now that has dried. I just want to darken it just a touch more, these darker areas. As black dries, it never dries as dark as I want, so I've usually got to give it a second coat. back to my number 5 Betty Hayway's brush. And I'm just going to paint the area around the eye here with the grey again. So this is the grey mix that I mixed up earlier. I'm just painting on the dry paper, looking at my reference photo as I paint. Just softening that edge there with the damp brush. It's got a little bit more paint then. Taking it down further. Now I just want to soften that edge. So again, I just do that with a damp brush. Getting a little bit more paint. I just want to bring it around underneath that shape that's there underneath the eye. So it's very pale. I don't have a lot of paint on my brush. So now I'm just dotting some more paint over that wet area. Just want to take it down, further down past the eye, down the side of the face here. So just be careful that you don't make it too dark. This is a white cow, and we just want to keep the colours fairly light. So I've just picked up some more paint then, taking it beside the nose and sweeping it back up the side of the face there. Now I'm just painting a bit more water onto this area. Now because the paper's damp here, I can just dot a bit more of the colour on. And I've also got some Windsor Violet there while the paper's still damp. A little bit more Windsor Violet. And I'm just softening that edge away again, just with the damp brush. I've dried that off with my hairdryer. Now I've got my scrubber brush here and I just want to gently remove a bit of paint just on that lighter section that's there. So my scrubber brush is damp, but my paper is completely dry. And I'm only pressing really lightly with the brush. I don't want to damage the paper. Take off a little bit here as well. That just creates a highlight there in that paint. So just make sure your paper's dry. So that's what I was using. It's a Silver Scrubber oval filbert brush. This is the 1/2 inch size. It's very stiff. You've got to use it when it's damp, but your paper must be dry, otherwise you'll create watercolour blooms. So now again I'm painting on the dry paper here. I'm just reinforcing this Windsor Violet, just taking it up over the dry area, around those highlights that I just created. So So there's a shadow beside the ear here that I want to put in. So I've just got the violet again, and I'm just going to run it down the side of the face here. Just on the dry paper, over the top of the grey that I painted. Now over here, I just want to dampen the paper. So I don't want it too wet, I just want it damp. Leaving that white area underneath the eye, haven't put any water there. Okay, so I've dampened all this area here with water. So I've got some of the grey mix again, just dotting it on with my number 5 brush, just onto the damp paper. It keeps all my edges soft. Again, I'm making sure the colour's not too dark. That area that I painted above the eye looks a bit greyer than the area that I'm painting now. It must have had a bit more of the burnt sienna mixed into the mix. This area here that I'm painting now seems to have a bit more blue mixed into it. But that's okay, it doesn't matter if it varies slightly. So I've left that white area showing underneath the eye. I don't want to put any paint on there. Got a bit more paint now. Just dotting again with my brush. Just want a bit of colour on the front of the snout here, so I'm just putting a bit of water there. And I'm just going to put a small amount of the grey paint just up through there. Just on the damp paper. That's all dry. Dried it with the hairdryer. And now I come back again with my damp scrubber brush. And I just want to put a bit more of a highlight here. So I'm just being gentle with it. Just takes a bit of paint off and creates a highlight. I want a bit more grey paint now. This time I'm painting on the dry paper because I've got no soft edges or hard edges to worry about. I'm just filling in the shape. And before this paint dries, I'm just going to use my bigger brush just to take off a bit of paint. Just use it as a sponge. And I'll also put some Windsor Violet on here, all while it's still damp. So I've just got my damp, larger brush now. I'm wiping it over the top just to take a bit of paint off. I keep dabbing it on a cloth just to get rid of the paint that's on it. So the paint hasn't dried, it's still damp. And now that I've done this, I want to dry it off with my hairdryer. So it's dry now, and I'm using the Windsor Violet, just like I did on the other side, painting over the top of the dry grey paint. So just using the watery paint on the dry paper. Here's another photo that you can download that just shows you where I'm at this stage of the painting. Okay, so this is phthalo blue that I have here. Now phthalo blue is a staining colour, it's very bright It's a Daniel Smith colour that I'm using. You don't want to use a lot of this. You want to use it watery because it will stain your paper and you won't get it off once you've put it on. So before I use it, I just want to put some grey paint above the top of the nose here. So I just want to put it along here, just a touch of the grey paint. So I'm going to wet it first, just with a bit of water, dampen the paper, just so that I get soft edges on my paint. And then I'll put a touch of grey there. I'll be using the phthalo blue around the nose as soon as I've done this area above the nose. Now I've probably got a bit too much water there, so I'm going to sop some of it up with my brush. So I'll just take this brush here and just spread it out a bit so it's not so wet. Now I've got the grey mix. This is the French ultramarine and the burnt sienna mixed together. That just gives me a little bit of colour above the nose. It creates an edge there above the snout. Okay, so this is where I'm going to use the phthalo blue. So I'm just dampening this area here beside the nose with water. I just want to put some colour along the bottom here. So I'll use the grey mix first. So the French ultramarine and the burnt sienna. Just along the bottom here. Just taking the paint out of my brush. I've got enough paint there that I can just spread it out now. So it's just a damp brush I'm using, no paint on it. Now I get some of the watery phthalo blue. Just dot it onto the grey. It just creates interest. I can't actually see blue on the cow, but I know this is a cool colour and this is a cool shadow and it just adds interest to the painting. I'm also putting some Windsor violet there as well. And I'm going to do the same thing on this other side. I dampen it first. Then I'll put the grey paint. Just while the paper's damp, let it bleed up from the bottom edge. I'll end up doing this a few times through the painting just to get it dark enough. And then I pick up the phthalo blue again, the watery phthalo blue. I dot that onto the grey paint while it's damp, and then I'll get some of the Windsor violet as well. Softening that edge there with my damp brush. Now I want to paint this little area underneath the mouth here, the chin. They're both dry, I'm not going to disturb them. So I just dampen one side with water, using my number 5 Betty Hayways still. So once it's damp, I pick up the grey paint. And I'm just going to run it around the outside edge. So I'll leave a touch of the white paper showing in the middle of this shape. So I've just taken the paint out of my brush again. I'm just using my brush as a tool just to push the paint around. So I've got nothing on my brush. I just make that white area there slightly larger. And here I'll also drop some of the phthalo blue onto the damp grey paint, just to repeat that colour. I'm only using tiny amounts of paint. I've dried that other side off and I've re-wet this side. I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm running the grey paint around the outer edge of the shape, trying to leave a white section in the middle. So there's two shapes there, one on the right side and one on the left. While that grey paint's damp, again, I drop the phthalo blue on there. Now there's nothing on my brush, and I can just move the paint where I want it. I also want to put a little bit up the side here. So I'm just dampening that paper beside the nose, across the top of the nose, and down the other side, just with a touch of water. Now I've got some grey paint again. It's a watery grey mix. And I'm just running that along the edge of the nose, the outer edge. So it's not actually on the nose, it's just on the area around the nose. Now my brush is damp, I'm just softening that edge further. Also going to dot some Windsor Violet along there while it's still damp. I've dried everything off. Now I want to fill in the nose with some watery Windsor Violet. So I'm just painting on the dry paper, and all that work that I did around the outer edge is all dry. And I've taken that Windsor Violet into the nostrils slightly at the bottom. So that needs to dry, so I'll dry it off with my hairdryer before I continue on. Okay, so I've dried it off. Now I want to darken this top section with another layer of paint. So I'm just glazing some more Windsor Violet over the top. This time it's slightly darker. So it's watery Windsor Violet, but it has a touch more pigment mixed into it just to make it darker. My paper's dry. So I'm not going to take this purple all the way down to the bottom. I'll just take it about halfway underneath the nostrils there. And I'm also going to paint some of the phthalo blue along the top edge. So I'm just softening that edge a bit with the damp brush there. Still just a damp brush. I'm just softening that paint away so it's not so hard. So this is the phthalo blue again. I'm just painting it onto the damp paper. So the paint hasn't dried from when I painted it. So it's just blending with the Windsor Violet by itself because the paper's damp. So that's all dry again. Now I dried it with my hairdryer. I just want to leave a lighter section here at the bottom of the nose. So I've just drawn that in to remind myself not to put any paint there. So now I want to work on damp paper. So I'm dampening the bottom half of the nose just with a touch of water, and I'm going to use some of the lamp black. So now I've got some watery lamp black, and I just paint that onto the damp paper. leaving that lighter section at the bottom of the nose. So because the paper is damp, I get those soft paint edges, which is what I want at the moment. So I was using the watery paint. Now I want to use the paint up here where it's squirted out so that I get the darker, richer pigment. So while that lighter paint is still damp, I can come in with this darker paint now. Just darken this bottom section. If you find your paper dries and you can't do this all in one go, then just dry it with the hairdryer and re-dampen it. So now I want to dampen the other side here. You can dry it off if you want to and then re-dampen it, or you can just keep going. Just depends how much control you've got of your paint and your water. So that side's damp now. Again, I'm going to use the watery lamp black to begin with. Just painting it on where I see it's darkest first. And then as I move out, it gets lighter. So now I just want to soften this edge at the top here with my damp brush. So now I need to darken this bottom corner here. So I use the pigment up here where I've squirted it out on the palette. So that's nice and dark. And I dot that onto the damp paper, just to darken that bottom right corner. Now I want to paint the nostrils, so I dried it with my hairdryer. I'm using the watery lamp black on the inside of the nostrils on the dry paper here. There is a lighter section at the bottom of the nostrils that I'm just trying to reserve as I paint. So now I've got some of the darker pigment and I can darken that area with more colour. Now I just want to darken this area here with some more of the Windsor Violet. I don't want it to be quite that light. So that's just the lower section of the nostril. Now I do the same thing over here. I paint the lamp black onto the dry paper inside the nostril. It's not too dark at this stage, I will darken it. Try and leave that lighter area of the violet showing at the base of the nostril there. So once I've got the shape that I want, I just pick up some more pigment and I darken up the top half of the nostril, just while the paper's damp with that first layer of paint. So I want it to be darker at the top of the nostril, and I want it to get lighter as it goes down. So now I've just got the damp brush, and I could just paint over that lighter area of violet, just so that it's not so bright and light. Okay, so I've dried all that area off now, and I just want to darken it. So I'm just dampening the paper so that I'll have soft edges, and I want to put some more black paint in there. So I've just put a bit of water in there, and now I've got the really dark black pigment just along the top section of the nostril. I'm just going to wash the paint out of my brush and just use a damp brush now, just to soften those edges. And I've got a little tiny bit of paint on my brush now, and I can just run it along the outer edge of the nostril. Just to dirty that section up. So I just want to dampen the paper in here now. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Just want to darken that top section of the nostril. So the lamp black again from the top of the palette where it's squirted out, so that it's really dark. Then I clean my brush out, take the paint out of it, and just use a damp brush just to spread that paint out further and soften the edges. And then I can use the little bit of paint that's on my brush for moving it around, just to dirty up the side of the nose here, down the edge, outer edge. So now I'm going to dry that off with the hairdryer. So I've dried it off now, it's all dry. And I've got some watery black now, and I just want to run it down the edge of the nostril here on the blue part. So I'll do the other side the same way. So it's just a thin strip of light black, just on the outer edge, on the blue part. I'm just darkening this area underneath the nostril with some more lamp black, just painting on the dry paper. I'm just patting the paint. I just want it to be a bit darker. And I need to do that on the other side as well. So a bit more of the paint over here too. Just on the dry paper. I want that lighter section showing down the middle, so I don't want to completely cover that. So there's no paint on my brush now, I'm just using what's on the paper there just to spread it out. Okay, so some watery burnt sienna now on the lip, just on the dry paper. So I'm just filling in that lip shape. And then I'll come back with a smaller brush and some more pigment, and I'll just darken it. So now I've switched to my little liner brush and I've got some more pigment, so it's darker. Just still, the paper's damp from when I painted it. I'm just dabbing this darker paint over the top of the lighter paint just to create a bit of texture there. Now I just want to darken these sections here while that lip dries. So I'm just going to paint another layer of the paint over the top just to deepen this shadow here. So I've just dampened it with water. Now I've got the phthalo blue. And a touch of the Windsor Violet again as well. I've just dampened this one on this side. I'm doing exactly the same thing with the phthalo blue first. Just on the damp paper. And a touch more of the Windsor Violet too. Okay, so now everything's dry. Now what I want to do is push these lips back. Now warm colours advance. They come towards you, whereas cool colours recede or go backwards. At the moment, this is a warm colour and it's coming forward. I need to push it back underneath the nose. So I'm just going to run a cooler colour along there. So I've just dampened that because I want soft edges. So while that's still damp, I'll just run some of that grey mix, so the French ultramarine and the burnt sienna, just along where the lip touches the bottom of the nose there. Now I'm thinking that's probably not dark enough. So I'm going to get some Payne's Grey in a moment and I'm going to just do it again with the Payne's Grey. So now I've got some Payne's Grey. The paper's still damp. And that just hopefully pushes that lip back underneath the nose. This area here is not dark enough, so I'm just running some of the grey mix over the top there. It's just a bit bright. Okay, this area around the nose here has got some whiskers and some little dots on it where the whiskers come out. So I just want to paint those on now, but I'm going to paint them on the damp paper. So I just want to dampen this area with water. The reason I want damp paper is because I want soft edges. I don't want them to be too hard. So while that paper is still damp, I'll just use my smaller brush and some of the grey mix. And I just want to dab it onto the damp paper. Now you don't want your paper to be too wet, or when you dab the paint on it will just spread everywhere. So you still want a bit of control, but I do want soft edges. So that's why I'm just working on the damp paper. Colour's not too dark at this stage. I will darken it, but I'm just not ready for it yet. So paint it beside the nose and above the nose. Some over here as well. Paper's still damp here. Now I've got some Windsor Violet and I just want to run it above the nose here. Just putting a little bit on the nostrils there just to tone that down so it's not so bright. Now I've got a bit of Payne's Grey. Just waiting for those spots to dry that I've painted a moment ago. So I'm just painting on the dry paper here, just adding a bit of definition underneath the nose there. You can use either lamp black or Payne's grey, it doesn't matter. They're dry now. I'm just going to come back with some more of the grey mix, so slightly darker this time. And I just want to put a little tiny dot inside those shapes that I made. You can use the grey mix here, or you can use Payne's grey. So I'm just painting it inside the little soft shape that I made earlier on the damp paper. So I'm not trying to create too many new spots, just using the ones that are there mostly. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of the cow tutorial. So in part 2, I'll finish off the cow.